Dr. Matthew Thomas, thank you so much for joining me again on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Austin.
I'm really excited about this. The viewers won't know. I mean, we've been just chatting back and forth for the past 30 minutes or so. And this conversation actually comes from us talking just over Facebook Messenger. And you had sent me this article that you wrote. And I forget exactly how you put it, but in only the way that you could, it was this like humble, like casual way of saying like, hey, I wrote this article, I think you might enjoy it. I set out to write like the definitive work on justification in the English language as an introduction. Let me know what you think. And I just loved it because like it's such a bold project, and anyone else telling me that, I would have rolled my eyes. But when you told me that, I was like, I need to read this right now because it probably actually will be this. And so I am so excited to talk a little bit about justification, and that article will be linked down below. But talk to me about the backstory of this project. How do you set out to do something like this?
Yeah. First off, thanks. I'm glad that you liked the material and everything, and I appreciate you having me on here to be able to chat about it as well. The story with the article was this actually was a project that Mike Bird, who is a New Testament scholar who works does a bunch of stuff with N.T. Wright. So they have what is it? It was like a New Testament theology book that they came out with fairly recently. So he and I have worked together on a few things, and he sent me over a message. I can't remember how long ago this was, but yeah, maybe 2.5 years ago, and said, "Hey, there's this thing called the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology. And it's really great, and I have this article on justification that I was asked to write." And he asked me if I would be willing to co-author it with him. So the idea was that the article itself would be kind of half based on like the biblical material, and then half based on like the history of interpretation, reception, and all that. And so he's like, I could do, Mike would do the first part of it, and then I do the second part. We put them together, and because we've worked well together in the past, I thought like, yeah, let's do it. That'd be great. So he then introduced me to the encyclopedia, which is a really good resource. It's got really good senior editors on there. So Alistair McGrath is one of them, and N.T. Wright, and I think Matt Levering, a number of really really just fantastic theologians who I respect a lot. So the idea behind it is to try to make what would hopefully be a definitive encyclopedia, for the English language, of all of these different kind of theological topics and resources, and to basically be a counterpart to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So you've got these articles from people who are experts in the field that are peer reviewed by multiple people and that are constantly updated, so that if you have a question in philosophy, you can go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and make use of it. So the idea behind this and where the funding comes from is that it's supposed to be a theology equivalent of that, so that anything that you want to know about Christian theology, or I know that they've brought it into world religions as well. This is going to be kind of the one-stop place that you can go to online to know that you have like a really good, fair and like reliable resource that you can also cite, that's free, and so that basically you don't get people citing Wikipedia for their research papers and things like that. So that's where the kind of the backstory of this comes from, and kind of the whole doing what's supposed to be the definitive thing in the English language. It's, I think, just the the aspiration that the encyclopedia has as far as what it wants to be as a resource. Mike then, because Mike is working with N.T. Wright all the time, doing all kinds of stuff, Mike ended up having to drop out and just basically said, "Hey, I think you could probably do this whole thing yourself. What do you think about taking this on?" And I think from my standpoint, I think because from having worked in, I guess you could say, related areas for a long time. So with the works of the law book, and then having done, writings in a number of other kind of cognate areas, I had so much research and so many different things floating around from the history interpretation already that I thought, you know what, this is probably going to be a big project. It's probably going to kind of consume my life for a long time. And, obviously, like financially, when you're writing an article, there's not a whole lot of like financial incentive. So it's not really a wise financial thing. But it'd be really cool to be able to take everything that I've, learned over the, these past, 10 years and working on this topic. And to be able to synthesize it and hopefully put it in a form where really anybody would be able to use and to hopefully benefit from it. So I said yes to doing the whole thing, and then it took me about a year and a half to actually write it. So a year and a half of researching, writing, editing, and it was honestly probably the hardest writing thing I've ever done. I think that my even though it's quite a bit shorter than my dissertation, which is the book, I think just the number of different topics that it's taking, the number of different angles that it has. I can't tell you how many times I just had to stop and pray and just say, Lord, I can't do this. This is so much, so far beyond, my capacity to be able to write or to be able to conceptualize, or even just think, how do you frame a discussion, which is really, I mentioned at one point, you're seeing here, the entirety of Christian theology from one angle, and in some ways, the entirety of church history from one angle. And for a lot of folks, justification, it is the doctrine. It is the particular angle. And so how do you write about this in a way that does justice to, how complex and rich and nuanced everything is, in a way that still is, accessible for readers and doesn't overwhelm them. So that's the backstory. That's how it came about. Took a year and a half of my life, and but yeah, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity, and I hope for readers that such as yourself, I hope that you guys are able to to profit from it, to come away from it with a greater appreciation of basically what God has given us in this doctrine. And hope if it's a diamond with a lot of facets, I hope that you're able to see more of these facets in a way that I definitely was throughout the year and a half of working on this.
Absolutely. And I really do think people who watch this channel are going to really enjoy the article. And anyone who's like just waded their feet in a little bit into this, I think can immediately recognize just the incredible amount of work that this would take. And I think, you talked about taking a year and a half, and that's with already having years of background research to build on. So, I think from all the future students that are going to cite this in their papers, which is going to be so many, like, I don't know if that'll show up in like your academia.edu page, but like it's going to blow up, I feel like, because of this paper, of all the citations of you. But I think they can all say thank you for putting this together, because it really is such a great resource. I want to, I'm so tempted in conversations like these to dive right into all of the kind of weeds of it, and to just kind of get into the doctrine. We're going to do that in just a second. But I want to talk a little bit on a slightly more personal level here, because I had a fascinating experience the first time that I interviewed you, in that I read your book cover to cover, Paul's Works of the Law in Second Century Reception. And I thought this was
a long title. I apologize.
It is. No, it's good. It's good. It's a fantastic book. And I thought, wow, this is so good. I don't know this guy, but let's set up this interview. And I don't even remember if it was before the interview or after the interview. It might have been after the interview that we've done this whole thing. And I asked, like, so are you Catholic? Are you Protestant? Like, I didn't even know what tradition you were coming from. And you said, like, well, that was kind of, part of the goal in writing the book, that it would be balanced and fair, that it didn't seem kind of polemical from any side. I think people will get that from your article as well. But I want to talk maybe just a moment about you. I'd be curious, how does your interest in justification relate to your own journey into the Catholic Church? Because it's something you're really interested in, and making that change was probably a really big part of your life. And I'm just curious to what extent those things overlap.
Yeah. Oh man, you're just trying to get me in trouble, Austin.
Today's video is sponsored by Logos. Logos is an online Bible software tool that fundamentally changed the way I read scripture, and it even helped me make one of the biggest theological decisions of my life. I first came across Logos a few years ago when I was studying for my theology degree, and I can truly say I don't know how I would have gotten through my degree without it. It makes in-depth word studies or theological studies or kind of exegetical studies of scripture so much faster and so much easier, and helps you engage with the text on deeper levels. But you don't have to be an academic to get a lot out of Logos. You can be just leading a local Bible study, and you want to go in armed with a little more context, maybe to get some ideas of what's going on in the Greek without actually knowing Greek. Or maybe you just want to do it for your own personal study. In fact, when I was wrestling personally through what does John 6 mean, I turned to Logos. And in that, I was able to go deeper into the passage than I ever would have been able to on my own. Here's how I did it. I would go to the text, and of course, you can read the text, and in my opinion, the text alone, I could go either way. Maybe it's literal, maybe it's metaphorical. But then I began looking at some commentaries. So I pulled up D.A. Carson. I could just have it up right next to the text, see what he had to say. And then I would pull up some Catholic commentaries, see what they had to say. But then, and this is where it gets really interesting, I could go back to the Greek and I could go back to the church fathers. For instance, I could just double click on the word feed or eat on my flesh and see that the Greek word here is trogo. And oh, really interesting. That has a very visceral connotation to it. Little points towards the literal side. But then the real kicker for me was being able to link to all of what the church fathers said on this. It's absolutely insane. Like back in the day, you would have had to spend a lifetime to do this. But now all of it's right there. You just click. Okay, so what does St. John Chrysostom say on this? Oh, interesting. Or what does Ambrose say? Or St. Basil? And all of a sudden, I was overwhelmed saying, wow, being able to see the Greek context, being able to see the best scholarship today, and being able to see what the church fathers have to say about this, came to the conclusion that Christ really is present in the Eucharist. And that level of study was only made possible by Logos. That's honestly only the tip of the iceberg. So if you want to get into Logos, if you want to deepen your Bible study, I've got some links in the description down below. You can use packages that are set up for Catholics, for Orthodox, or for Protestants, whether you want kind of more church fathers, magisterial documents, whatever. You can see it all in there. And if you use those links, and please do, you will get a discount that will make it cheaper than otherwise. And not only will you get a great discount, but I'll get some support from that as well. So if you want 10% off anything there, or even more off some of their main packages, use the links down in the description. Well, thanks, and I hope you enjoy it.
I appreciate you asking that. So for me, my hero is C.S. Lewis. He's the person that I owe the most to. I think theologically, and just the impact that he's had in my life. I wrote like a little. It was for this edited volume. I wrote like a little kind of testimony thing. And I was saying, you can almost like kind of date my life, like sort of before Lewis and after Lewis, in the sense of, when I first read, Mere Christianity when I was 19, the impact that had on me. And so I think for me, both consciously and, subconsciously, I've been trying to emulate Lewis and everything when it comes to ministry, to academics, all of that. And one of the things that I think is, I've really appreciated about Lewis is the way that Lewis doesn't try to foreground his own particular, opinions on things. And so, the way that, his aspiration is to be, an ordinary layman of the Church of England, and to basically, from that vantage point, to try to talk about Christianity, so as to present what it is that has been agreed upon, by all Christians, or the vast majority of Christians at all times in history, and to let that speak for itself. And for me, that's what I've always tried to do. That's what I always refer back to. And then also the way that Lewis does, to try to be, honest and fair, when there are disagreements among traditions. So if one tradition says this, another says this, to be really fair in talking about those things, but also to not get caught up in the differences when there's so much that does already, unite us, and to use the things that already do unite us as the basis for everything that that we do, and hopefully for building to greater unity. And so he's he's the person I've always been trying to emulate in this. And then I think also you just having Alistair McGrath as an example of somebody who I think does a really good job of this also, of giving you, really good descriptive accounts of Christianity in a way that is, fair and even handed as much as, as any of us are able to be. I think he does a really good job of kind of taking the principles that, Lewis has, and then, doing those kinds of things, it's sort of, a generation later. And so I've really tried to learn as much from them, as I can. I think as it relates to Catholic stuff in particular, I think in a lot of ways, for me, I try to, I don't know if I want to maybe say, not foreground particular Catholic things or really foreground any particular denominational things, just because I recognize, as I think, Lewis did, how, things that relate to denominational identity can often end up being divisive, where they can kind of stop question or conversations before they get started. And so for me, I've tried to not foreground any of that kind of stuff. I also just personally, and this is I would say something I'm really, really grateful for, and something I really regard as an advantage. I'm fortunate to have a lot of roots in different branches of Christian denominations and all kinds of different things. And in that sense, I owe debts to a lot of places, and that, not being from like a Christian background originally, and then having bounced around so many different varieties of Protestant churches, really just all over the place, and having really profited from all of them in different ways. I recognize that each of those bodies are, they're places that God has used in my life, and in one way or another. And so I want to do everything I can to to honor that. And I mean, honestly, you probably know this some too, Austin. Sometimes the best way that you can honor folks in those kinds of situations is just to not talk about Catholic stuff at all, just because I think for a lot of us, and myself included with my own background, kind of the Catholic Church is this sort of big scary other thing, and we don't like that, and I know what that feels like. And so having said all that, I think that as it relates to my own story, you mentioned my book. The research for that, all the original, me first getting into the doctrine of justification was, I was just a pretty much like low church evangelical student who was working in like an inner city ministry and stuff, and was ended up writing a paper for J.I. Packer up at Regent College on this topic. And then from there, as I was learning more, that kind of got me studying more about the history of interpretation, which got me studying more about church history, and then ended up, from kind of low church evangelical, ended up Anglican for a number of years, as my wife and I both were, and then did most of the writing and research for my dissertation, which became the book, as an Anglican. But of course, when you're dealing with these, faith works justification, you have all of those 16th century debates in the background. And so I think it's impossible, or hopefully, I mean, genuinely, it probably should be impossible, because you want for this stuff to actually make a difference for our lives. I think that when you're assessing kind of positively, negatively, and everything in between, the claims that come out of the Reformation period, if you aren't necessarily coming down like really firmly, like, yeah, I'm a big Calvin guy, or I'm a big Luther guy. If you're like, actually, what, I'm really into Irenaeus on this, I think he's kind of my guy. Well, then again, existentially, the question is, well, what are you doing on Sunday then? Like, how does this relate to your life? And so, all this to say, all of these things, that when it comes to justification, talking about these various topics, they definitely have had an impact in my life in ways that have, been really challenging in a sense, because you're dealing with, questions of your own, ecclesial identity. And I think, studying this stuff shouldn't just be an academic discipline. I think that would, in a sense, be the greatest, betrayal to C.S. Lewis, would be just to be studying this stuff as if it doesn't matter for what we actually do. And so I can't hold the material, at arm's length, that way. Having said that, I think I'm also able to, hopefully, and I mean, Austin, you can tell me if I'm successful in this or not. I think the fact that I am sort of, my DNA is basically like a Protestant mutt, where I have like a little bit of all kinds of DNA in me from all these different sorts of backgrounds. There's a way in which, for instance, in writing this article and writing about all the varieties of Protestant interpretation when it comes to justification, I find I'm able to draw upon that background and hopefully helping readers to see from the inside how it is that these ideas work. So if you are an Anglican, here is how these things work. If you're an Anabaptist, this is the way that historically, these theologies have worked. And which, each of them in their own way, they have their own internal kind of consistency and logic when you stop and sort of see it from that particular vantage point. And so one of the things that I'm really grateful for is, and having that Protestant mutt background, I'm able to hopefully employ that. And, in the case of, Luther, for example, which is, where you can see in the article, this is where I really focus a lot of my attention. Whether you agree with Luther on justification, whether you disagree with Luther on justification, or you're anywhere, in between, I've really tried as hard as I can to help to make the thought of these figures intelligible. Because it's not, I don't think, sufficient to say, this is what this person thinks, if it's unintelligible why they would think what they're thinking. Like when you get to Luther saying, denying free will and saying, I wouldn't even if it existed, I wouldn't want it. Why would you say something like that? Like where would that come from? And the thing is, if you spend enough time with Luther, if you spend enough time reading his writings and trying to place yourself in his shoes and trying to sort of develop that almost like epistemic, like empathy, I think you really can get to a point where you say, I understand the logic. I understand exactly why you would say that. And that makes a lot of sense. Now, you might ultimately disagree or agree with the conclusions that he reaches, but I think that's where we want to get to, is to be able to have that kind of empathy with, the people who we're engaging with. And that's something where I'm really grateful for my background, because having been a part of so many different church contexts and backgrounds, it helps me to, get a sense of perspective there that I don't think I would have otherwise.
And that's huge. And that's exactly the kind of work that I want to do on this channel, which is why I'm so glad you're here. And I often tell people that, if they're looking at one of these traditions, whether that be kind of like the Lutheran interpretation or the Calvinist or the Catholic or Orthodox or what have you, these interpretive traditions that have been around for hundreds or thousands of years, and all you can think is, that's just a silly way of reading it. Chances are you don't fully understand it yet, because like you said, each of these have an inner logic to them. Now, that doesn't mean that each of them is therefore true, but it does mean that before you kind of write it off or you just dismiss it, it's worth really getting to know it. And I think that you've done that well in the article. And, if someone went to it and heard at the beginning of this, like, oh, okay, so Dr. Thomas, he's a Catholic, he wrote this article on justification, it's going to be this like apologetic slam dunk. Like, that's not what this article is. And that's the only case in which I could see someone coming to it being disappointed. But I think if someone really wants to learn and understand the various positions and traditions of this really important doctrine of justification, I think what you've done is super helpful, and hopefully we'll get to do a little taste of that here in this conversation.
Yeah. I was just going to say that probably the most encouraging thing I've had was I think the day after the article came out. I had an email from a retired Lutheran professor, and he sent over just the kindest email you could get. and was just, I mean, he's worked in these areas for a long time, and he was so just encouraging, and it was awesome. But one of the things that he said in the article, and again, he's a Lutheran professor, says, I can't figure out what your denominational identity is. So whether you're like an evangelical or a Roman Catholic or any, um, and that, I think I took that as like the highest compliment of just the fact that he had no idea what I was, based on having read to the end of this almost 20,000 word article. And so I sent him an email back saying, how much I appreciated his kind words and everything. And I deliberately didn't answer his question for him. And then he wrote me another email back, which is also very kind, and said, you also didn't answer my question as far as what you are exactly. So yeah, it was really fun. And for me, that was, I took that as a huge encouragement, because that was what that was my aim in this, is that to try to represent everybody so fairly that you wouldn't necessarily know the background of the person who wrote it. Besides that, they were able to put themselves in the shoes of this particular reading tradition, and to be able to explain it in a way that actually helps to make it intelligible for a wider audience.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that anecdote there. So you mentioned early on that one of the difficult things among many in writing this is figuring out how to frame it, right? Because there's so much history, there's so many different schools of interpretation. And one of the kind of things you use to frame it at various points are these kind of two questions around justification. And that is the location and the timing of justification. And now I think, for people that are really deep into this conversation, they might understand that. But I want to kind of be able to draw in a wider net here, because for others, they might just think, well, the question about justification is works or not works. Like that, that's it, right? Or maybe if they're a little further in, like, what do works mean? But I think this idea of location and timing is a really helpful way to think through various positions. So could you just give a kind of brief overview of why this can be used as a lens to through which to look at various perspectives on justification?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Austin. There's a number of questions I think that you can pose when it comes to the doctrine, and things that you can where you can ask this of a particular interpreter or interpretive tradition, and in answering that question, you can really gain insight into their understanding of what they mean by this. And so if you look at the location, in a lot of ways, this can, I think in some instances, be even the most helpful one. When we're talking about justification, are we talking about something that's happening inside of us, or we're talking about something that's happening outside of us? That's actually really, really interesting to think about. I think, again, having a some more of a traditional Protestant background, I would say, I probably tended to think, and I mean, at a DNA level, I probably have some of this it's still in my head as well. You almost jump to the assumption that it's something that's happening outside of us, because this has to do with the forgiveness of sins primarily. This has to do with God, because of what Christ has done, forgiving our sins, taking them all away, and so that we're regarded as righteous, or we're counted as righteous. We're forgiven. That understanding is, I think, within a lot of evangelical contexts, is the predominant one, and it does have has real roots within within the 16th century, and reading that as the kind of big thing when it comes to justification. On the other hand, if you were to say, no, I think justification is not something that's taking place outside of me, it's something that's taking place inside of me, then you're probably dealing with a different kind of thing, because you're not just talking about sort of the believer's account before God. What you're talking about is, what kind of person am I actually? What kind of thing am I actually? What kind of what is it that I am actually becoming? What is God actually making me? And then what's interesting then is what you see as far as judgment goes. The idea of justification being something that takes place outside of us, that can sometimes, the phrase legal fiction can get used to describe that, which is to say, I'm treated as if I am righteous, though I am not actually in reality. I have sort of the, if you want to use the language of merit, or, the merit of, of Christ's, of Christ's passion, that is, in a sense, applied to me in that way. That's an external thing, but that might not actually correspond with the internal reality of who I actually am. Conversely, if you see justification as being something that's taking place inside of you, well, you're probably, the nature of justification would seem to be this transformative thing, where it actually takes you as an unjust person and actually turns you into a just one. It actually changes you in some kind of way, which is a different kind of thing. Now, you can have those both go together. You don't have to do an either or. And one of the things that I try to draw attention to is that actually, for most of church history, both of those ideas have been present when it comes to, how Christians have understand, justification to work. But you do have, kind of later denominational, emphases, and then certain contexts where there is an insistence that no, it's the one, or it's just kind of the, the other, and it can't be this one over here. And so I find that the inside outside, language can be helpful to kind of just get a, almost kind of get a read on what is it that we're actually talking about when we say justification, because so often you can use that language, but different people will mean different things by that. And so you can say, oh yeah, do you believe in justification? I do. But person A means, I mean that, God has forgiven all my sins on account of Christ. Person B means I've been transformed by Christ, and I am being transformed by Christ from an unrighteous into a righteous person. And those are related, but also not identical necessarily. And so it can be really helpful to, again, get a read on some of those differences. If you look at the timing of justification, this is one of the things that I think actually when we go back and really look at the Bible and try to synthesize the biblical material, I think that we end up finding that it's hard to not talk about justification having three different kinds of aspects, in the sense that there is often, justification is referred to as a past action. So, we were justified. And if you read the article, it kind of gives some, biblical examples for all of these. But you can talk about, having been justified in the past, which again can have to, do with, the forgiveness of sins, or if you want to think of it in a transformative kind of way, the actual transformation, the renovation of the heart that takes place, like at baptism, for example. You can talk about justification as a future action, which usually has to do with the idea of our final vindication before God. So if we are before God's judgment seat, the verdict of not guilty, the verdict of innocent and acquitted, that we have before that judgment seat, that can be regarded as justification, which is then talked about in the future tense. And then you can have this middle thing, which is presently being justified, that present reality. And this, again, this is challenging if you see justification strictly as a legal matter. But if you see it not just as a legal matter, but also, in a sense, as an ongoing, effective one, whereby we're transformed from one kind of thing to another, made, from unjust into finally, hopefully, perfectly just by God's grace at the end, then it makes sense that you could talk about justification as having this present aspect as well. So we are being justified. And I think that when you actually go through all the biblical material, and I say this is something that, I remember first coming across this, I think in, I think it was in Daniel Wallace's intermediate Greek textbook, which is a fantastic textbook. I remember him talking, about this, the past, the future, and then the ongoing aspects. And there really is, I think, biblical warrant for all three of those.
That's really helpful. And, speaking of kind of the past and into the present, I want to talk a little bit about the history of justification, which, rumor has it you've spent some time thinking about as well. And, in your first book, you talk about Paul's theology of justification, specifically around works of the law in the 2nd century or so. But in this article, you then stretch it way up to the present period. And so I guess what I want to get at here, which I think a lot of people will be interested in, is how like stable of a concept is justification from, say, the second century to the Reformation. Huge time period. And if you want to break that down into different ones, feel free to do so. But I think what people might be curious about is that, do we essentially have one view of justification that is steady, 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 Reformation, complete break kind of thing, and then we have splinters of people interpreting differently? Or do we see more fluctuation? How would you just describe that history? Obviously, we have to use somewhat of broad strokes here, but I'd be curious, when you look at that, if you were to kind of map that, is it stable? Is it varied? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, I think it really is remarkably stable. That's in some ways almost kind of a surprise. If your starting point is kind of the diversity of perspectives and the various polemics that you have, in the 16th century, if that's what you're accustomed to, then the history of interpretation prior to that is really it's really quite surprising in a sense. I think I found that for myself as somebody who my first point of entry in this, besides modern discussions, definitely was the 16th century, where you have such varieties of interpretation. I think that you can say it is remarkably stable, and with a couple of exceptions, and I'll talk about some of them. It is one of the things that you'll notice. I was rereading the article again yesterday, and one of the things that I found, and I don't know if you have this impression or anybody else will have this impression. I think that you might find the article to be slightly boring before the 16th century. And I don't think that's because the material isn't really interesting, because I find the material to be hugely interesting. But as I've broken it into the various parts of the history interpretation, I have a section that's on the earliest reception, where I'm really focusing on the first couple of centuries, so kind of closest to the biblical sources. And then I take which is a synthesis of tons of different. I mean, that's kind of like 10 years of research, all synthesized into one section. And then I focus on two figures. So I focus on John Chrysostom and Saint Augustine, and I do those because they're really good representative kind of Eastern and Western, readers, specifically of Paul. I think in the Eastern and Western Christianity, they're probably the two most influential interpreters of Paul throughout history. And they're also, I think, significant because, Luther and Calvin, they point to Augustine and Chrysostom as the people who, they value the most. Obviously, Calvin, both of those figures. Luther's not that huge on Chrysostom. He likes Augustine. He's not the very biggest Chrysostom fan. And then I go from there to medieval interpretation. And so I focus on the Glossa Ordinaria, which is the medieval biblical commentary that kind of synthesizes all of patristic and medieval thought into one thing of commentary, which is great. It has awesome insights. And then I focus on Thomas Aquinas and look at his understanding of justification. And if you had no idea what the history of interpretation was, you might just think, why does this article need to be so long? Like, why are we talking about all of these things in so much detail? Because granted that you can have different kind of insights and points of, emphasis, there's very little to speak of as far as controversy goes within, basically up to the 16th century. It really is a stable doctrine. And so that is in some ways, it makes it so that once you do get to Luther, you're kind of dealing with the late medieval nominalist stuff, and then you get into Luther. In some ways, it gets a lot more interesting because you see Luther has this fresh reading, and you're like, wow, that's a very different perspective. It also has its own internal logic to it, but then it also has tensions as far as how does this thing really hold together with this piece over here? And so how does that work? And then you see how each kind of subsequent figure in their own ways tries to work out and navigate those tensions and end up putting together these things that, are in some ways have similarity to Luther, in some ways to the previous tradition, but some ways are doing entirely, new things as well. And so in some ways that, the article gets most interesting once you get to the Reformation period, because you find finally some new stuff here, some new material. Having said that, you can, I think, talk about, some instances where you have deviation from the received and kind of commonly held tradition of justification within the first 3/4 of church history. So one of them would be the Ebionites. So they Tertullian, I think he identifies them with basically holding to the position of Paul's opponents in Galatians. And so from their standpoint, justification does come by the Mosaic law. And so they think Paul was wrong. He didn't get that right. You actually have to become part of the Jewish nation in order to be justified. And so they're obviously, it's a very different reading tradition there. Instead of being not justified by practicing the law, from their standpoint, you are justified by practicing the law. And so that would be one example of you might say, a dissenting view. Marcion offers sort of a dissenting view. So again, here we're in the 2nd century. But there's some ways in which he's kind of a false positive, because though a number of interpreters will regard him as a precursor to Luther by the way that he has this really firm law-gospel distinction, Marcion isn't fundamentally concerned with questions of justification. He's fundamentally concerned with the God of the Hebrews being a different God than the Father of Jesus. And that's the essence of his law-gospel distinction. It's not precisely, or even in a lot of ways, even necessarily really close to the kinds of questions that Luther is coming into the text with in the 16th century. But you can still look at him as potentially having a dissenting view. And then finally, when you get to Augustine versus Pelagius, Augustine identifies the Pelagians as themselves having a novel doctrine of justification. And for Augustine's standpoint, what the Pelagians are, what makes them distinctive in their understanding of justification is that for them, justification doesn't have a transformative element. The Pelagians, for Augustine, don't see justification as actually changing us on the inside because of their understanding of the powers of human free will. That's actually not necessary. So justification, it includes the forgiveness of sins, so it has that forensic aspect, and then it includes sort of the teaching and example that Christ gives to us, but it doesn't actually need to, and doesn't really include that effective aspect. So humanity actually being transformed from an unjust person to a just one. And so those would be 3 dissenting views you could point to, throughout kind of church history, before you get to the 16th century. But it's remarkable when you spend time in these sources. You just don't have a whole lot of fighting over this material. It seems as though people are pretty well agreed what it is that they're talking about, even if there might be a greater kind of emphasis in one figure versus another.
So what's really interesting here is that once we get to the Reformation, everyone kind of wants to claim Augustine as their own, it seems. And they're all going to him and they're finding inspiration from him. And I'd be curious, what is it that we find, what does Luther, say, find in Augustine that is revolutionary for him? That, was it sitting latent in the text the whole time, kind of Augustine? Because it's not like Augustine wasn't being read between, the 5th century and the 16th. Everyone's reading Augustine. He's a towering figure. But Luther's going to find something there or he's going to bring something to Augustine, maybe, that causes him to ask new questions. And so I guess on the first hand, what does he find in Augustine? And then maybe what are the questions that begin to be asked? Because I guess I want to pair this with, you write in the article that's important to recognize that the questions the fathers were asking weren't necessarily the questions that were asked during the Reformation. So we can't necessarily expect the fathers to be answering later questions, or, they're not weighing in on the latest trend of justification debates because, well, these are anachronistic to their time in some ways. So a lot of preamble there. But what is it that Luther and the Reformers are finding in Augustine, and what questions do they begin asking?
Yeah. So this is one of the areas where there's some, and you have to, I guess, kind of speak kind of reformer to reformer, because not all of them are identical in this area. This is one of the areas where the reformers end up having some of the most disagreements with Augustine. I mean, if anyone's interested in a just a really easy summary of this, I think Alistair McGrath in his Christian theology textbook, he does a really good job of summarizing, at the Reformation period, how you kind of end up having the Lutheran standpoint on one side, and then the Augustinian standpoint, which the Council of Trent, restates, on the other side. And so it ends up Augustine ends up being an issue for them. Now you kind of have to start with saying, at a foundational level, there's some real deep affinities, for Augustine. Luther starts as an Augustinian monk, and I actually think that that's like a great way to frame the whole thing. That's where he starts, and so he doesn't really end with Augustine. He begins with Augustine, and there are certain things, I think, throughout his career that he still identifies, with, and where he still sees, Augustine, and he kind of on the same side. But he doesn't end as an Augustinian monk, and I think that before too long, he ends up finding Augustine's theology of justification to be less of a solution and actually more part of the problem. And so you have the famous quote, which gets used all over the place, which is from Luther's Table Talk, where he's kind of saying, his relationship to Augustine. And he says, at first, I didn't just merely read, but I devoured, Augustine. But then as soon as I discovered what it was, the wretchedness of faith meant, then it was all over with Augustine. And so when he comes to what for him is the definitive, at least within his framework, the definitive understanding of what justification is, this requires an end to his Augustinian phase, because the distinctive features of Luther's theology end up actually being quite anti-Augustinian in points of emphasis. So, for instance, on the nature of justification, which Luther in his mature phase wants to say is strictly a forensic thing, is strictly the forgiveness of sins, and isn't this kind of inward transformation, which is where Augustine's always placing the focus. For Luther, he sees that as opening the door to all kinds of things that he thinks are really inherently problematic, and so that's why he has to say things like it was all over with Augustine. Having said that, there is the love-hate relationship never ends, I think, and even when he's sort of like one of those significant others where you say it's all over with them and then they're back again. And that's kind of in some ways that the Luther-Augustine relationship, where he can be all over with him. He's not an Augustinian monk anymore. And then whether from force of habit or he just thought he was reminded of something that he liked, he'll be back to quoting good old St. Augustine again in one area or another. And he does, I think, even in having to say things like it was all over with him, I think he still does retain this lifelong affinity. And I think that some of that goes back to, I think that he still sees what Augustine is trying to do in the anti-Pelagian period as having an anti-Pelagian, just to for anybody who doesn't know, this is the end of Augustine's career, where he's writing against Pelagius, who's insisting that man can be justified by their own efforts apart from receiving the grace of God. And Augustine's saying, no, that doesn't work. Oh, good. Have fun trying that. That doesn't work. And I think Luther, for all the the disagreements that they end up having, on say the nature of justification, even though fascinatingly, and this for me is one of the most fascinating things of the whole project, seeing that there is these weird affinities between Luther actually and Pelagius, and that both of them insist upon justification as being this this forensic and in a sense strictly forensic action, even though they do it for completely opposite reasons. Having said all that, I think that Luther, I think he looks at the errors of his own day as fundamentally Pelagian. And so because of that, with Augustine as the great anti-Pelagian, it's impossible for him to not still have this kind of affinity for him and to still view him in some ways, as a kindred spirit. And they do still have real links in their theology. I think that when you spend, a lot of time, with Luther, even with, all the points of, difference in emphasis there might be, or real differences in doctrine, there still exists affinities there too. And I think that you never get to a point where Luther is consistently always saying an anti-Augustinian interpretation of justification. It seems like there's a lot of places in which I don't know if it's whether it's consciously or unconsciously, he almost reverts back to his traditional categories and ways of saying things, which for Luther scholars is endlessly infuriating, because you're like, okay, I got this guy. I figured him out. This is what he believes. This is what's distinctive about his doctrine. We got it. And then you come across another passage in his writings and you're like, oh, great. Fantastic. Here's something else that we have to account for. So that's a little bit on the Luther-Augustine relationship. I don't know if you had any follow-ups with that, Austin.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could talk about it all day. I think
we can just talk about it all day too if you want. I'm fine.
Yeah.
Fine with that. I'll let my wife and kids know that they have to stay at the park for longer.
So I think, just for the pleasure perhaps of my Orthodox viewers, I want to touch on just a comment you made, like, really briefly, but I want to circle back to it because I think people, their ears might be itching. They might be intrigued at this. And then just so you know where we're heading after that, I do want to touch on this idea of nominalism, because you mentioned that in passing as well. And I think it's really important to understanding what's going on. But the first kind of in passing comment that I wanted to bring up is, you mentioned Luther didn't have much love for Chrysostom. Can you talk us through this just a little bit? Why not? And where did they butt heads?
Yeah, so some of that's going to get into some of the stuff with nominalism, later. And so we can save that, a bit. I think that the biggest thing is that this is, justification is one of the areas where, and you might say the area where Luther has, the most disagreement, with traditional interpretation. And he recognizes that, he acknowledges it. So I think as a result, when he is, you can find all kinds of, quotes from him against various church fathers, whether it's, Chrysostom or, Jerome or Origen or, any one of them. And then occasionally, Augustine too. I think because from his standpoint, he really thinks that, and it says, genuinely, he believes that his way of interpreting Paul and his way of interpreting, scripture, it really is the right way, and the other ways are really wrong. And they end up leading you into all kinds of error. For him, looking back, through these earlier fathers, whether it's Chrysostom or whoever it happens to be, and seeing the way that they're talking, from his standpoint, it sounds like they're all inconsistent. It sounds like they're all talking out of both sides of their mouth, because they'll talk about God's grace. They'll talk about all these great things and God acting completely to justify us. But then they also seem to talk about their own efforts somehow being incorporated in these kinds of, conditionalities and things like that. And for him, it all sounds like a bunch of equivocation. I think his own philosophical standpoint is such that it isn't intelligible. And for him, it doesn't seem true to the biblical text as he's best able to, to understand them. So it's true. You end up getting some negative stuff towards the fathers, both Eastern and Western. And then one of the things that for me was so fun in this article was looking at the story of the correspondence that we have from the Lutheran theologians that are in Augsburg. And then them writing to Patriarch Jeremiah in Constantinople, and the back and forth that they had in talking about these issues, which I find to be really, really, illuminating, just in the sense of there are real places that they have agreement, and there's also ones where they have real clear disagreement, where the Patriarch is just like, I can't figure out what you guys are talking about here. And then he'll quote, Chrysostom to them, and then they'll say, yeah, but Chrysostom doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so those conversations, though they end up, going nowhere, I think they're really, really interesting, because I think there's a lot to learn in that. A lot of the fault lines that you see between kind of Western Protestant views and then Eastern views, you see all of those differences already spelled out centuries ago by these figures. So if you are an Orthodox reader, I recognize that Orthodox perspectives, as there are just generally in biblical studies, are really underrepresented in discussions on justification. And so I've really tried to spend time to incorporate Eastern stuff within this article more. So if you do have Orthodox readers, I think that they'll enjoy this. And again, as somebody who is, I'm in California. That's about as west as the West gets. But I'm somebody who is just constantly my own faith and practice are enriched by by Eastern sources as well. So I hope that in this article it's able to pass on some of the riches that I've encountered.
I love that. Well, I promise we're going to get to the juicy question of nominalism here in just one second, but I can't resist briefly. We've talked so much at the beginning about this idea of how important it is to understand the inner logic of the position that maybe you don't hold. And, if you were able to sit down with Luther and maybe give him a lesson on understanding the inner logic of a position he doesn't hold, what is he missing in Chrysostom? Because when he reads Chrysostom, he said he looks at it and it's inconsistent. It doesn't make sense to him. And so if you could give like an interpretive key to Chrysostom, to maybe not Luther, he doesn't seem like a guy that would take well to being corrected on something like that. I don't know. But maybe just someone listening, of if they read Chrysostom and they're like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, I don't see the inner logic. What's maybe a little interpretive key that could help?
Well, if we can, maybe we can kill like two birds with one stone here, because I think this has to do with the nominalism question that you're wanting to ask.
Let's do it.
And because this is one of the things that is one of the themes that I kept coming back to in researching and writing this article, and then reading all of these figures and seeing the debates back and forth, east, west, north, south, everywhere. So often they end up talking past each other, particularly in the 16th century period, and then going on from there, based on different philosophical frameworks that they have. And I think that ultimately the distinction between Luther and Chrysostom, and when I say Chrysostom, you can say any of the Eastern fathers, really. You can say pretty much any of the fathers generally, is that they hold to a different relationship or understanding of the relationship between divine action and human action. Divine causality and human causality. And they hold to what you might say is a compatibilist or a non-competitive framework, where humanity and God both operating 100%. There's no contradiction between them. That's not the framework that Luther is holding to. And that's really where you get a lot of the key differences. And that's where I think, whether you think they're right or wrong answers, that's where you start to get all kinds of new answers to these questions, is when you hold to a different framework. And so just to give a really brief, what do we mean when we're talking about, nominalism? So this idea, usually associated with William of Ockham. And so I think Occam is really helpful to come back to, because everybody knows like Occam's razor. So what's Occam's razor? Well, you simplify. If you got something that seems like it's overly complicated for no reason, well, then you simplify it. Because why would you make an overly complicated thing if you can just do a less complicated thing that's going to do the same job? And so what's Occam engaging with? What kind of precedes Occam? I have a quote here from the article here. So if you're to look at Aquinas and saying, how is it, and not just Aquinas, this is Augustine, this is really all the figures before them. When it comes to questions of how does God's action and humanity's reaction, how do these things relate to each other? This is how Aquinas says it. So I'll read this here. So traditionally, the operations of God and humanity had been understood to function on distinct planes, so that God's free action was what enabled humanity's secondary agency, with no logical contradiction between the two. As one example, Aquinas writes that while, and this is a quote, one action does not proceed from two agents of the same order, nothing hinders the same action from proceeding from a primary and a secondary agent. So what does that mean? Well, if we're going to say, if we have two planes of causality, so here's primary plane and here's secondary plane. The primary plane, you can have somebody operating, they're the primary actor. A secondary plane, there's a secondary actor. And because there's two different planes of causality, there's no contradiction between them. And so to say that one person does this 100% and that the secondary cause does this 100%, there's no contradiction. The same way you can say with me using a pen to go and to write. Say, okay, well, who wrote that thing that's on the paper? Was it me or was it the pen? And you would say, well, it's not like really 50-50. It's kind of like 100%, 100%, but it's me as the primary agent. And then at the primary kind of plane of causality. And then the pen is the secondary agent, the secondary plane of causality. So that's the traditional model, and that's what in talking about justification, up to getting into the the 15th century, that's philosophically that's what people are thinking. What's Occam do? Well, Occam simplifies. What does that mean? It means that instead of talking about these different planes of causality, and that sounds complicated, I don't know what we're talking about, we'll just simplify it. So we're going to talk about God's action and our action in a univocal kind of way. So it's going to be, we can say God did this or I did this, and we're only talking on one plane of causality. So instead of being one here primary, one here secondary, here we're talking, this is all one plane of causality. We've got rid of all the confusing other things. We just made it simpler. Great, simplify it. Fantastic. We love simple. What does that do? What that does as it relates to the doctrine of justification is this. Instead of, under the previous model, where you could talk about God as acting 100% as the cause of our salvation, and then you could talk about man as in some way as a secondary cause, so dependent on the primary cause, but still as a real cause, as operating 100% for our salvation. Whereas in the previous model, that could make sense and there was no logical contradiction. Under this newer model with Occam, you can see it doesn't really work because there's only one plane of causality. And so it must mean, if we're saying, okay, who are you justified by? Who acts in justification? How does that work? You kind of have to say, well, there's only 100% to go around, and we're all sort of we have to divide it now. And so maybe God operates 100, maybe like 90% for our salvation, and maybe we operate like 10% for our salvation. Or maybe it's like 50-50. It's like a partnership. So God does 50% of the work for our salvation, and we do 50% of the work for our salvation. Or maybe 25. I mean, there's all kinds of ways you can construe this. This gives you a totally different sense, and it ends up breeding all kinds of theologies within the late medieval church that, from my vantage point, I think are frankly abominable. And I think that Luther thought they're abominable too. And so it's probably the area where I have some of the deepest affinity for Luther is in looking at these kinds of things. We're saying, okay, maybe God acts 50% for our salvation, and then we act 50% for our salvation. The idea, and I think that here Luther just has really good Catholic instincts and really good biblical instincts, and I've tried to bring these out. The idea that God somehow acts less than 100% for our salvation seems to Luther to be a most damnable heresy. And I would agree with him there. I think he's absolutely right. I think that biblically, he who has not spared his own son for us, how will he not give us all things? How do you read the Bible and think that God hasn't acted 100% for our salvation? So there's, in a sense, he's got good Catholic instincts there. There's no problem. Where's the issue? Well, the issue is the philosophical system. Because for Luther, because he's holding to this nominalist, I'm holding my hands out again, because he's holding to this nominalist system where everybody has, basically, by the way, my finger, I play goalie on an indoor soccer team and I broke my finger. So that's why it looks funny, in case you're wondering, Austin.
I've done that exact thing before.
Did you really?
I have.
Yeah. It's it hurts a little bit, but it's okay. So Luther, he's on this one plane here. And he has that Occamist system, this nominalist system. Well, there's only 100% to go around. And so if God acts 100% for our salvation, what does that mean? It means that we act 0% for our salvation. And this is one of the places where Luther is most insistent, that the righteousness of faith has to be entirely passive. We have to receive it 100% as a gift. Why do we have to receive it 100% as a gift? If it's not, then you're taking it away from God. Anything that you're taking for yourself, if you're going to say, I'm only doing 2% here. That's it, just 2%. What are you doing? You're stealing from God at that point. You're taking what belongs to God, and you're saying, God, let me just have 2% of that. Well, guess what? You're saying, God, you can only operate for my salvation 98%. How does that honor God's action in our salvation? It completely dishonors it from Luther's standpoint. Also, what are you, as a fallible human being, going to do with that 2% of your salvation? You're going to screw it up. Of course you're going to screw it up. Salvation is just going to be lost in the process. Anything that we try to take away from God, it's inevitably going to be lost. So from Luther's standpoint, because he holds, and this is one of the things where it's actually really helpful in Luther, is how clear he is throughout his writing that he's an Occamist. He holds to this kind of William of Ockham model. And so there's only one plane. We're simplifying things. And it's either God's acting 100% and, we're doing 0, or we're going to try to do 100% and he's going to, do 0. Or if we try to divide it, then we just get a bunch of nonsense that just doesn't take you anywhere. He, looking then back to get to your original question, and this applies to, to Augustine as well, which is uncomfortable for him, of course, but it's the truth. When he looks back at figures like Chrysostom, what does he say? He says, well, Chrysostom, he can speak, really wonderfully about, God's action for our salvation. He can speak really compellingly about that. It sounds like Luther. But then there's other places where he talks about us working for our salvation as well, where there's some way in which we participate in these kinds of things. And from Luther's standpoint, this is just nonsense because there's only 100% to go around. And so if anything that Chrysostom is saying that we do for our salvation, you are necessarily taking away from God. So Chrysostom, he thinks he's talking, a big game about how God does everything for our salvation, etc. But at the end of the day, he still thinks that we do like 33% of this, and that, God only does like, 66.67 or something like that. And that's the way that all of these figures look to him, which is why he's so frustrated and dismissive of them, because from his standpoint, you can see even, psychologically, I think how there's real consequences from this. If you hold to that philosophical system where divine and human action are on the same plane, what that means then is anything that we are doing for our salvation, we're taking away from God doing it. And that, for Luther, is terrible. Now, if I'm just going to say my own standpoint on this, I hold to the earlier model. I don't hold to the Occamist model. And I think that the Occamist model, even just biblically, if you're going to take like Philippians 2, for example, which is one of the passages that I look at towards, the end of the article, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And you think, boy, it just sounds like that's us doing it all, right? Here we are working out our salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who, who's working within you, both to will and to work according to his own good pleasure. And that sounds like God does everything. And the answer is yes. I think that that's absolutely right. I think that that God, being on a divine plane, being the primary cause of our salvation, he does indeed act 100%. And so in that sense, I think that Luther objecting to some of those late medieval theologies that portray God as acting less than 100% for our salvation, as somebody who is kind of within the Catholic tradition, I say absolutely preach the gospel. That's fantastic. And so there is a real good Catholic instinct that I think that Luther has there. the question is, does God acting 100% necessarily mean that we, are and remain entirely passive with anything? Or are we on a secondary plane of causality where God's primary causality enables us to be able to work? And from a standpoint of Philippians 2, I would say, I think it's exactly what Paul is saying. I think he's saying to work out our own, salvation with fear and trembling, which again makes it sound like the ball is all on our court. Well, it is. It's 100% in our court, but it's only because God has done this 100% for us on the primary plane, and He has then enabled us by the power of His Holy Spirit to then act as real agents, even though it's in a secondary way, which is entirely dependent on His primary action for us. And so that's the thing that you keep coming back to over and over in Reformation era debates, and then in the 500 years that have gone on since then. And one of the things that's been really interesting, just in recent decades, is how even among Protestant scholars, there really has been this revival of basically kind of the pre-Occamist view, that actually philosophically to say that God acts almost like God's a creature, and that He acts on the same plane of being as created beings does. That doesn't seem to make any sense. And so a lot of really good New Testament scholars, I mean, John Barclay is somebody who's done a ton of good stuff on this, and N.T. Wright would be somebody else, and helping from Protestant standpoints, helping to return to this pre-Occamist model, which in my view I think is good, because I think it actually makes more sense of the biblical day and is more compatible with it than the one that tries to force everything onto a single plane.
That's really helpful. And as we begin to land the plane here, I want to kind of talk about where we are today and how we might continue to come closer together on these things, which I think the church writ large has really done a lot of, especially after the Second Vatican Council and in recent years of trying to understand one another in these things, and made some real progress. What's interesting to me, I guess, to ask here is that it seems like, at least in large part, one of the issues is not just biblical interpretation. It's not just like a matter of historical theology, of kind of getting, sorting through the historical data correctly, but it's really this question of philosophy and nominalism. And you mentioned that there's been great work done by people like John Barclay and N.T. Wright to kind of revive a pre-Occam view on these things. I guess my question would be, what's next on that development of bringing Catholics and Protestants, or even Orthodox as well, closer together on this issue? Is it like, even if we successfully were to overturn the kind of Occamist view of these things, what's left? Are we just agreed at that point, or is there important steps that you see as the next thing once we could maybe even agree on a philosophical framework? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and in some ways it's difficult to answer. I can give you a couple of ideas, and then we kind of go from there. Maybe to start with one of the challenges, even just saying "we" kind of presupposes that there is there's like a one kind of party that we're that we're dealing with here, when really that absence of a "we" is, in a sense, kind of the biggest challenge. If you think just in terms of kind of who speaks for who at this point. If you take the joint declaration on justification, from about 20 years ago, between the Lutherans and the Catholics, I mean, it's really, I think, a significant piece of work, and working through a lot of important things together. But at the end of the day, part of the issue is that the particular Lutherans that were a part of this thing don't necessarily speak for all Lutherans. And there's a lot of Lutherans who say, hey, you're saying we this and we that. We're not part of that we. That's not who we are. And those are some of the most, like, I think, conservative and faithful Lutherans who reject it, who say, we're not in this we. So you guys feel free to do whatever you want to do. But that's not what we're doing. That doesn't speak for us. So I think that's part of the challenge that we that we have. If I'm thinking in terms of sorry, I'm texting my wife because she just said, "Are you still podcasting?" Yes. This is what it's like doing biblical scholarship with four small children and a delightful and wonderful wife. If we're thinking as far as what are next steps, where might things go? I think that the nature of justification is one of those areas that I don't think that we can. I don't think we can avoid talking about it. I say this as somebody who, from my own native background, I came to this just thinking justification as a declaration. It's the forgiveness of sins. It's just that, and it's not the sort of being made righteous thing. And I think that there is a tendency for biblical scholars, especially Protestant biblical scholars, to just sort of act like we can just sort of agree that we think that this is what this means, and we don't have to deal with anything else. One of the things that's interesting actually is if you go back to the some of the debates we have between the old perspective and the new perspective over the past number of years, that would often be one of the rare areas that you could get them to agree. Would be, okay, well, we still all agree that justification is just this forensic thing, this declaration of righteousness or forgiveness. It's like, okay, cool, we can at least agree on that. That's fine. And the challenge is we have to cut ourselves off from so much of the history of interpretation to be able to make that stick. And I think that we have to cut ourselves off from, even, those interpreters who were closest to the apostolic sources, who lived within the same culture as they lived in, who spoke the same language that they did. And we have to go back and tell them, sorry, Clement of Alexandria, sorry, Origen, sorry, fill in the blank. I know that you speak Greek as your first language, but it turns out that you don't speak good enough Greek. I over here in California, I have a second year Greek textbook, and so I can confidently tell you, justification actually just means being declared righteous. It doesn't mean all these other things that as far as transformation and being made righteous. Sorry, so just listen to me because I obviously have a privileged vantage point. I don't really think that works. And I think that's one of the things. If you're just asking me, put on my, put on my see into the future glasses, I would say I've experienced that in having to wrestle with, being part of interpretive traditions that really think that way of interpreting, the text is wrong to say this is about being made righteous. Just having to, kind of deal with the fact that pretty much all of the early readers of Paul say this. Pretty much all the early readers of the New Testament and in the vast history of interpretation, all of our Orthodox brothers, everybody, they all continuously say, yeah, that's what's going on here. That doesn't mean that there's not a forensic element to it, but that's a huge piece of what it is to be justified from the standpoint of the vast majority of Christians throughout history. And I think if we're going to say Western, largely Protestant biblical scholarship, I think that we're maybe still yet to really grasp that and to really deal with those implications. And in some ways, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that, because if I'm just, again, taking my own experience with this, understanding justification as more than just this forgiveness thing, as more than an extrinsic thing, but as being about the renovation and the recreation of humanity. This then changes the way that you think about the nature of the gospel in some ways. And I think in some really cool ways as well, in that there are things that within Scripture that we might find more difficult to implement, that suddenly seem to fit together a lot more naturally. And there's things that you might say have to do with maybe evangelism on one hand and discipleship on the other, that maybe didn't always fit together as naturally as they might. But when you have justification not just being about your sins are forgiven, but this is about you actually being made into a new person, God actually making you a righteous person, turning you from unjust to truly being, being just in the image of his son, the righteous one. There's a lot of things that I think that within that model, you're able to integrate that, at least in some parts. So I'd say my own Christian formation, we're actually quite fragmented before, and fragmented in ways that I think were, not really helpful and not really particularly biblical either. And so I think that, again, I say us as probably, Protestant biblical scholars, because that's my own background. I think for us, I think that's really going to be a challenge, and I think a really good challenge to integrate the that effective sense, that transformative sense of justification, both into our ways of reading Scripture and into the ways that we then think of how that doctrine then informs the Christian life as we understand it. And I think that as we do that more and more, I think that there will be more, you can say, affinity, and more mutual understanding between, our ourselves, and then, our just, Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters. I think that in some ways, our own practice will seem, less fragmented to them as we do that. So that's one thing that I think is kind of on the horizon. And I think there's certain places that I could point to where you see people really, really wrestling with this. This is one of the things. I'm a huge, John Barclay fan, obviously, and he's somebody who, has, in my own work, has played a major role. He was the examiner of for my dissertation way back when I used to be his TA a long time ago, and so I go back a good ways with him. And this is one of the areas where I've really challenged him with stuff, and I know that he's really wrestled, like, what does it mean for justification to actually really be an effective action? And for a lot of biblical scholars who have always thought within just that forensic model, it really is challenging. But I'm excited to see how that broader perspective ends up having, I think what will hopefully be good and, challenging, but ultimately, fruitful theological reflections.
Dr. Thomas, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. And insofar as that is the future and present of the conversation around justification, I'm grateful that your voice is one that is reaching far and wide now, and may it continue long. But once again, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're the one with the voice that's reaching far and wide here. I just do the obscure academic stuff, and then you're the guy that shares all the good stuff with people and makes the connections. So thank you for being the voice to people for these kinds of things.
It's my pleasure.